Well, I'd first like to say that, the humanity today finds itself in a really interesting new situation, which is that we live in an urbanizing world, which means that already the majority of people in the world are now living in cities, but in developed countries, it's much larger than that. I mean, 70, 80, even 90%, for instance, in the Middle East, it's over 90% even. So humanity has not traditionally been used to living in this way, in this particular, living in very, very large cities of many millions of people. I mean, in the past, the largest cities on the planet were about 1 million people, like Rome 2,000 years ago, or London, 200 years ago. Now suddenly we have cities of 20 million people or more. And so certainly Singapore is not quite as large as that, but certainly here we are faced, or you are faced with major challenges on how to make life both livable for people as well as, environmentally sustainable in terms of the resource use. So certainly I think there's been a lot of very good thinking going on to planning Singapore. It is a green city in terms of, lots of trees everywhere. Also half the space of the city is still green spaces. So that is very impressive indeed. I think when it comes to actually managing the life for people in terms of their resource use, then I think obviously you are again, have done a lot of useful things. It's a very clean city, but waste is a big issue because everybody every day produces waste from their consumption patterns. So certainly I think the fact that you are not faced in the streets, in the environment of the city with waste, but that there's, it's a very clean city, it's a major achievement. However, when it comes to dealing with that waste that people don't see, certainly you have come up with reasonably interesting and worthwhile solutions by doing incineration, by creating a waste island out of sight, out of mind. That is certainly important for the existence of the city. The question that I'm particularly interested in is how can the organic waste in particular that is produced in a city like this be recycled and reused on farmland? And that's certainly where I think you still have major challenges. Given the fact that we need to feed cities, that the food has to come from somewhere, ultimately that land where the food is to be produced has to stay productive. In other words, we can't take food from land and not return fertility back to it. And that is a challenge that I think Singapore still needs to deal with in new ways. Of course, much of that food comes from Malaysia and elsewhere. So a give and take between how we absorb, how we use food, and how we need to ensure that farmland stays productive is a big challenge. Transport-wise, I think you have done a great job, with some 60% of people on their daily journeys traveling in public transport. That's very impressive and really quite special. I mean, most cities in the world are congested because people have to rely so much on the motor car. That is not the case to anything like that degree here in Singapore. Very impressive. Also the way you've linked the housing nodes with transport nodes in a very worthwhile way. That is clearly a really significant achievement, is regarded as such in many parts of the world. Good practice in public transport. I mean, a famous example is always the Brazilian city of Curitiba with its rapid bus transport system that is being replicated in other places, such as Bogota, for instance, in Colombia. But in some ways, I think what you are doing here in terms of the really well-developed public transport systems really needs to be given or used as an example in cities elsewhere. I think in many ways you are the teacher and other cities who should learn from you in that respect. Yeah, so I've already talked briefly about waste recycling as an important point. We are so used in our modern world just to take products, take everything that we buy in the shops, use it and then dump it somewhere else. So obviously in an island city such as yours, you can't afford to do that. So that's why you're quite good at pioneering aspects of waste recycling as well as incineration. And so certainly, that is an impressive way in which to deal with this problem. I think ultimately, obviously your industries here in the city are geared to producing new products rather than absorbing the technical waste from the waste stream into production processes. So I think the very structure of industry in Singapore does not easily allow for technical recycling, recycling of technical waste. So technical waste tend to be incinerated if they can be burned, or possibly, I expect, probably exported to somewhere like China and India, or else dumped, of course, and the waste dump here. So I think certainly the concept of cradle-to-cradle waste management, in other words, not having cradle-to-grave where you dump a lot of stuff in the holes in the ground, is very important. The very fact that we have very little space for landfills has led you to both incinerate and to do some recycling, but I think there could be a lot more of that than there currently is. Urbanizing world that we live in means tremendous need for learning processes. We have never been in this kind of world before. So this means that there needs to be a lot of information spread between cities across the planet. And there are many organizations that do that. There are many conferences of this kind. What I've noticed is certainly here the conference is above all else about people working within Singapore. And so clearly people from the transport sector to be in the same room with people from the housing or from public parks or from waste management is very important for internal learning. I think when it comes to wider sort of information distribution between cities, obviously this is not the Congress to do that primarily. I mean, there's probably some people, I'm from Europe, and there's a few other people here from China and from India probably. But by and large, I think this Congress is above all else for Singapore itself, people to learn from each other with a little bit of injection of information from elsewhere, such as Sir David and myself, who've been flown in from London. I think clearly Singapore needs to develop future perspectives that go beyond what is currently discussed internally. The reality is that Singapore as a city depends on food being imported from Malaysia and elsewhere, on energy coming from elsewhere. You produce products that for the world market. And so in some ways, the vulnerability of a city such as Singapore, dependence on fossil fuels that are not going to be around forever, dependence on food that also is globally, becoming an issue, dependence on water from some of the water, at least from Malaysia still. These are issues of vulnerability, I think, that still need to be addressed more vigorously. I mean, you've done a great job here in Singapore in addressing the water issue with water recycling, the way it's done here being really very advanced. And I think the know-how that you've developed here clearly is of relevance to other cities. But certainly the long-term existence of a city such as Singapore in a world of growing resource shortages, both from the point of view of food supplies as well as from the point of view of energy supplies, I think needs to be more actively addressed. Also the question of climate change. I mean, there's an awful lot of fuel that is burned in cities like Singapore. Where do the waste gases end up in the atmosphere? What does that mean for the future of the planet? So urbanization, which Singapore is a prime example of, needs to be addressed in a big picture way. I think the discussion needs to go beyond internal discussion about how to improve the micro aspects of life within Singapore. A lot of planning is from 5-year plans, 10-year plans. I think we need to think also of 50-year and 100-year plans, which is difficult because the governance systems, people are elected on a short-term basis. And so they like to think about, the next few years, and also people living in a city are concerned with the day-to-day life, but we also need to think much more about our children and grandchildren and their future existences, and that certainly, I think, needs to be addressed more in congresses such as this.